This is the BBC. For details of our complete range of programmes, go to bbcworldservice.com/podcasts.
Welcome to the latest global news, recorded at 14 hours GMT on Friday the 5th of January. I'm Jonathan Blake with a selection of highlights from across BBC World Service news today. Coming up, they say he's like a child. The author of an explosive book about the Trump White House says the president's staff say he needs instant gratification. Mr. Trump has called the book phony. This woman was among those who queued through the night to buy Fire and Fury.
I think I'm really looking forward to all of the quotes. I think I'm looking forward to imagining, who in that White House has actually said this. I think no one really gets tired of palace intrigue.
Also in the podcast, the Spanish Supreme Court has rejected a bail request by the jailed former deputy leader of Catalonia, Oriol Junqueras. Saudi Arabia will allow foreign investors to buy shares in its national oil company Aramco.
This is an important part of the Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman's approach to trying to make the Saudi economy less dependent on oil.
And later, we head to a town known as the saxophone capital of China.
It's a really amazing place. There's this little town about 3 hours outside of Beijing where you walk in and you see people on the streets holding saxophones. You see farmers in the cornfields playing saxophones.
But first, a controversial book about the Trump administration has gone on sale after the White House failed to block its publication. Booksellers in the United States have reported unprecedented demand, and the release of Fire and Fury has been brought forward by 4 days. Katie Scott was one of several people queuing in the middle of the night to buy a copy at a bookshop within walking distance of the White House.
I think I'm really looking forward to all of the quotes. I think I'm looking forward to imagining, who in that White House has actually said this. I think no one really gets tired of palace intrigue.
President Trump has dismissed what he called the phony book and its author in a series of furious comments and said it was full of lies. The author of the book says sources described Mr. Trump as being like a child and having no credibility. Michael Wolff had spent much of last year in the White House. Paul Adams reports.
The book is out and the president is furious. In Washington, would-be readers queued until midnight to get their hands on the first copies. Far from being intimidated by threats of legal action, the publisher brought forward the release of Fire and Fury by 4 days. Tweeting last night, Donald Trump said the book was full of lies and misrepresentations, and he said he'd never given the author, Michael Wolff, any access to the White House. In a television interview this morning, Mr. Wolff asked why he had been given months of access if the president hadn't wanted him to be there. He said he had notes and recordings of his conversations in the White House and said his credibility was being questioned by someone with less credibility than anyone who had ever lived. And he repeated his main assertion that over time, those around Mr. Trump had all reached the same conclusion, that he's not fit to be president.
Paul Adams. The book cites former top aide Steve Bannon as describing a meeting with a group of Russians at which Mr. Trump's son was present as treasonous. After the president met Republican senators on Thursday, a reporter asked Mr. Trump if his former strategist Steve Bannon had betrayed him.
Thank you all. Did Steve Bannon betray you, Mr. President?
Thank you.
Any words about Steve Bannon?
I don't know. He called me a great man last night, so, he obviously changed his tune pretty quick. All right, thank you all very much. Thank you. I don't talk to him. I don't talk to him. That's just a misnomer. Thank you.
So will they patch things up? Has to be said, it sounds unlikely. Benjamin Hanwell is a friend of Mr. Bannon. He's the director of the Human Dignity Institute, a religious think tank in Italy. Dan Damon asked him if he thinks his friend can hold on to his job at the Breitbart News Network.
I think he can, and I hope he does. I think what people need to do is zoom out slightly and look at precisely what he said in the context of what he was saying. And I think it's clear that he wasn't attacking or betraying even the president nor his family. I think specifically what the press is interested in is the meeting that took place at Trump Tower with three of the senior campaign operatives. Two of those people are quite well known, Jared Kushner and Don Jr. The other person was the then campaign manager, Paul Manafort. And I think, I don't speak for Steve, I'm not his spokesman, and this is my reading of what's going on. But I would think that Steve's comments were directed principally against Paul Manafort rather than against either Jared Kushner or Don Jr.
How important is the money coming from the Mercer family, Rebecca Mercer, to Steve?
The Mercer family money is very important to Breitbart, but it's money to Breitbart rather than to Steve. directly. I think Rebecca Mercer said she will continue to support Breitbart.
Where do your interests coincide with Steve Bannon?
My personal interest, since I've known Steve, has been very much aligned to what he's trying to do. I share his view that American politics is deeply corrupted and is working against what's called the forgotten American.
What was it about Donald Trump that Steve liked and thought he could use to implement his agenda for the forgotten men and women?
I don't think either Donald Trump or Steve Bannon looked at one another as a person they could use for their respective agendas. I think there was a natural overlap of interests. And I think what first appealed to Steve and continues to appeal to him to this day is the fact that Donald Trump is 100% genuine about what he's saying he wants to do in his identification of what's wrong with the American political system, what he's trying to do now that he's president.
What about Steve's own presidential ambitions, which he has expressed?
I'd be very surprised if there was anybody working in American politics at any senior level that doesn't daydream about what it might be like to have the top job. I think as far as Steve's concerned, he's concentrating on helping the president from outside fulfill the agenda on which he was elected. If Donald Trump should say, look, I've given 4 years now, I'm now approaching 75, and I've been vilified and attacked. I've had my reputation shredded in the national media. All I've tried to do is help the country. If after 4 years Donald Trump should say, I've had enough, and if the populist nationalist agenda has been betrayed by the congressional GOP, I would be surprised if there wasn't a groundswell of opinion that was asking Steve to make a contribution.
Benjamin Harnwell. Away from the US now, and the Supreme Court in Spain has turned down a request for bail by the jailed former deputy leader of Catalonia, Oriol Junqueras. The move will stop him going to the Catalan parliament to be sworn in 12 days from now. Mike Sanders reports.
Oriol Junqueras fought an election campaign from prison near Madrid last month. His Republican Left Party came third in the election, behind the pro-union party Ciudadanos or Citizens and the ousted separatist leader Carles Puigdemont's group Together for Catalonia. But the Supreme Court ruled that there was a risk that Mr Junqueras would commit rebellion, sedition and misuse of public funds if freed. Those are the accusations he faces in connection with October's independence referendum, which the courts ruled illegal, and the unilateral declaration of independence that followed.
Mike Sanders. Now to Saudi Arabia.
In a world of challenges, we're working to find solutions by seeking to unlock the potential in every molecule we produce. At Saudi Aramco, we're ready for the future.
An excerpt from a corporate video by Saudi Arabia's state-owned oil corporation, Aramco. It's being converted into a joint stock company, allowing foreign investors to buy its shares on the stock market for the first time. The sale of up to 5% of the company is expected to take place this year. It's a key part of Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman's plans to raise funds to invest in other areas, reducing the kingdom's dependence on oil. I spoke to our economics correspondent Andrew Walker about the technical but significant change.
Absolutely. Creating this status of a joint stock company is an essential prelude to putting those shares of the business onto the stock exchange. And Saudi Arabia does have in mind listing both on the domestic stock exchange in Riyadh and on some major international exchange as well. London, possibly New York. Those are the kind of options involved. And this is an important part of the Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman's approach to trying to make the Saudi economy less dependent on oil than it has been. He has quite a wide vision, but part of this is about getting some funds in from selling the shares off to invest in all kinds of other things. And the need for diversification, I think, is quite clear from what's been happening to Saudi government revenue as the oil prices fell from its peak the peak that it reached in 2014. The government's finances swung wildly from a very large surplus to an even larger deficit at one point, and we saw total government revenue decline by, at one point, more than 50%.
So we said there this could be the world's biggest company. Give us a sense of how big and how much money Saudi Arabia can make from this.
Well, the Crown Prince has suggested the business could be worth as much as $2 trillion. A lot of independent analysts think that's perhaps overdoing it a lot. But yes, certainly an extremely valuable business. And if his figures were right and they were to successfully float 5% of the company on the market, then you'd be looking at a very large figure indeed, something of the order of $100 billion. So that's really very substantial amounts of money. And of course, a lot more could come in if over time they were to sell off further stakes.
And any sign at the moment how keen foreign investors will be to get in on the act?
Well, I think they will be keen, but there will also be certain reservations. The company is very much entwined with the government in Saudi Arabia, so that makes for some accounting issues, it makes them quite complicated to disentangle fully. They'll also be acutely aware, I think, that the government is going to retain an overwhelmingly large majority stake and will be in charge of all the key decisions. But nonetheless, it is an enormous business, and I have no doubt there will be substantial interest among foreign investors.
Our economics correspondent Andrew Walker. No one in China is calling it the Great Leap Forward, but the target China's President Xi Jinping has set his country, lifting 43 million people out of extreme poverty in just 3 years, is, if anything, even more ambitious than Chairman Mao's industrialisation policy of the late 1950s. In his New Year address, Mr. Xi described the policy as a solemn promise. Mao's enforced removal of peasants from the land to become factory workers in the cities left the harvest rotting in the fields. At least 23 million people, perhaps as many as 55 million, died. In the half-century since then, China's cities have boomed. Its middle class has grown and it's become a consumer economy. Yet the gap between wealthy urban centres and the many remote rural communities has not been bridged. The BBC's China correspondent, John Sudworth, has travelled to one of those places that has been left behind, a clifftop village in southwestern Sichuan province. It can only be reached by climbing hundreds of metres of ladders.
Step by step and hand over hand, laden with bags and babies, people are hauling themselves upwards on an 800-metre, 2-hour climb. Some people even have the breath to sing on this extraordinary series of steel ladders that wind their way up the sheer mountainside. In places, the old, treacherous, homemade wooden ladders are still visible. Funded by the government, the new ladders, although vertical in places and still dizzyingly high, are quicker and much safer. It's the only way to the village at the top. Mud brick houses nestle on the edge of a deep mountain gorge. The hand-to-mouth existence in Atuliar village hasn't changed much in hundreds of years. Erdi Labi is tending to his beehives with one of his 5 children, scooping out a few handfuls of honey.
We are so poor. All we can grow is some corn and potatoes. We don't have anything else.
The government says that it wants to wipe out poverty in the next 3 years in China. Do you think it's possible?
I don't really think so.
But one man in particular is insisting that it can be done. The improved access to this village, with its new steel ladders, has won praise from none other than China's President Xi Jinping. So this is your typical family home, pretty basic. There's an open fire in the centre. The smoke just goes up into the rafters. And out here, just outside the door, but inside the courtyard still is the lowered area where the pigs live. Then if we head to the front of the house, through this old wooden door here, outside is a notice. And this lists in great detail the kind of poverty that this family experiences, whether they need help with food, with clothing, with education, with healthcare, and so on. Home by home, village by village, China's plan is to end extreme poverty for 43 million of its poorest people in less than 3 years. Here's one of the more radical ways it intends to do so. This brand new school is the centrepiece of a brand new resettlement village. Simple, neat, affordable homes with whitewashed walls and their own front gardens. For the past 12 months alone, China set itself a relocation target of more than 3 million people. Le Suo Zernu and her husband Jiba Tuba are proudly showing me their new kitchen.
You no longer have the open fire, you no longer live close to your animals. Do you miss those things, those traditions?
We don't miss the old way of life or the unhygienic things like having a pigsty right at the door.
The Communist Party, though, is desperate for success. Almost 70 years after it came to power, the issue goes right to the heart of its claim to legitimacy. It'll be an uphill struggle, maybe, but for President Xi Jinping, improving the lot of all of those left behind by China's extraordinary development is now a key domestic priority.
That report by John Sudworth in China. You're listening to Global News, the best stories, interviews and on-the-spot reporting from the BBC World Service. Every weekend you can hear a review of the week's main news stories and why they matter. That's in the world this week. And here's Johnny Diamond to tell us what's in the latest edition.
We are jam-packed with insight on the programme this week. Once again, Iran has been gripped by demonstrations, but this time they were different. Posters of the supreme leader were torn down. 40 cities saw disturbances, attacks on the leadership that has provided little in the way of economic good news for ordinary citizens. On the Korean peninsula, the north has slightly softened its stance ahead of the Winter Games in the south. Our Tokyo correspondent is just back from a trip to Seoul and has the inside gossip. China has said no to a whole load of plastic waste it used to buy and recycle from the rest of the world. It may force big changes in the way we consume and cast away. And Hollywood's women scoop up the dollars in 2017, but will anything change because of it?
And now back to the Global News podcast. Childbirth asphyxia is one of the biggest killers of babies in the world. Now, a startup company in Nigeria has come up with a simple and cheap way of potentially saving the lives of hundreds of thousands of newborns every year. Richard Hamilton has the details.
The World Health Organization defines childbirth asphyxia as the failure to breathe. It happens when a baby's brain and other organs do not get enough oxygen before, during, or immediately after birth. It's the third highest cause of deaths in children under 5 and is responsible for almost 1 million neonatal fatalities every year. It can also lead to permanent brain damage, but can happen without anyone knowing. At the moment, its detection requires expensive diagnostic machines which examine the baby's blood, but which are not available in most of the developing world. But the Nigerian company Ubenwa has devised a mobile phone app that can detect asphyxia in seconds. Dr. Eyenimi Ndiomu is the company's clinical advisor.
Ubenwa in Igbo language means the cry of a baby. Using artificial intelligence, you can actually identify the frequency and amplitude of this cry. When you compare with normal babies, you know that definitely it is different. The thing about the mobile app is that you can actually download the application in the phone and then you record the cry of a baby for about 10 seconds. And then it does the analysis to match the cry if it is normal or if it's abnormal. So it comes out with positive and negative results. What we are looking at is for mobile devices and then also wearable devices which can be deployed in the hospitals.
The company's founders say that they have had a 95% successful detection rate in trials of 1,400 pre-recorded babies' cries. The startup is now raising funds to acquire more data to improve its accuracy rate, as well as to conduct clinical trials in hospitals. Then it needs to get the necessary regulatory approvals and medical licenses. Benoit has so far reached the second round of an international competition known as the IBM Watson AI X Prize, for which the winner will receive $5 million.
Richard Hamilton. The damage to coral reefs from global warming is worse than previously thought. That's according to a new study published in the journal Science. Professor Nicholas Graham is the co-author of the research and a coral reef ecologist at Lancaster University in Northern England.
The really worrying finding is that whereas 40 years ago, coral reefs would experience a coral bleaching event on average for a given location once every 20 to 30 years, the average return time of these bleaching events now has reduced to only 6 years. The problem here is that for recovery, if bleaching leads to extensive mortality, which it sometimes does, and lots of the corals die, the recovery rate is a minimum of 10 years for the fastest growing corals. So if these events become this frequent and are extremely severe and cause a lot of mortality, the likelihood of recovery starts to reduce. There's movements to try and engineer corals to be more robust against climate change. But ultimately what we need to be doing is reducing local pressures. So things like managing fisheries more carefully to maintain the species that can aid recovery of reefs following these events, reducing the input of nutrients and pollutants so that reefs can bounce back and recover more rapidly. Then ultimately reducing carbon emissions is absolutely essential because this is an ecosystem that's at the forefront of the impacts of global warming. We're seeing this ecosystem being destroyed at vast scales today. If global warming continues on a business-as-usual trajectory, we will lose the world's coral reefs in a relatively short period of time. I'm talking decades.
Professor Nicholas Graham. All the Money in the World has become known as the film Kevin Spacey was in and then wasn't. Spacey had finished shooting his role as the oil tycoon John Paul Getty, but then he was accused of sexual harassment. And just weeks before its release, the director Ridley Scott reshot all of Spacey's scenes with Christopher Plummer playing Getty instead. The film is being released in the UK today, something that would not have happened, Ridley Scott admitted to our arts editor Will Gompertz, if Spacey had remained in it.
Miss Getty, we have your son. $17 million to release him.
Clearly to do that was very uncomfortable. I was completely taken by surprise. But honestly, within about an hour, my commercial head starts to click in, and I realized I had to do something about it immediately. Christopher Plummer had always been there, almost alongside Kevin from the start as a possibility of Getty. I went straight to Christopher.
Nobody has ever been richer than you are at this moment.
I have no money to spare.
What would it take for you to feel secure?
More.
Was it, therefore, a commercial, not a moral decision?
That's tricky. I think it's a little bit of both. But moral is a word we can talk about for the next 2 hours, okay? But so I'd like to say initially it was a commercial decision which would be maybe a little hand-in-hand with a moral decision. But, you know, you can't take the artist and actually whatever a person decides to do in their private life which doesn't harm others, you've got to separate them from what they do as an artist.
But you didn't separate them because you made this decision.
The film wouldn't have gone out. The film would not have gone out if I hadn't done it. That's simple.
Yeah. How complicated was it reshooting it and remaking those scenes? And did you have to drop any of your previous scenes with Spacey in this movie in its final cut?
Everything of Kevin Spacey is removed. There are 22 scenes that we had to redo. I'm very specific how I make movies, and so people say, well, did you take the opportunity to re-improve anything? Not really, without being conceited. I know what the hell I'm doing after all these years. So I was slotting stuff into it, and that, of course, protecting my new Mr. Getty, because he must own the part. He can't be just following in Kevin Spacey's footsteps.
Christopher Plummer and Michelle Williams have both been nominated for Golden Globes. What we're hearing about the Globes from the Time's Up campaign, which is a lot of actresses and people in the movie industry supporting a change in culture in Hollywood, will be wearing black dresses in support of that notion. Do you think we're looking at a moment in Hollywood where things actually are going to change, where the sexism will subside and women will get a fair crack of the whip, or do you think it's window dressing?
I think a bit of each. I think there'll be an immediate change because there should be, that's long, way overdue. You know, I've never experienced any of those things that you described. In my life and my companies, I've frankly got women running my companies. I've always been a great supporter of strong women without actually ever thinking about it, which is, I think, the best way.
The director Ridley Scott speaking to our arts editor Will Gompertz. You're listening to Global News. Kenny G's Songbird, of course, and that's enough of that. Just one of the tracks the American saxophonist has been known for since the 1980s. Perhaps unexpectedly, we're going back to China for this story and a town in the northeast called Sidankou, where saxophonists and the music they play are particularly popular. Thousands of the residents earn their living making up to 10,000 saxophones a month in local factories, and at night they play the very instruments they make in public squares and in the streets. Javier Hernandez of the New York Times has just visited Sidankou and told Alan Kasuja more.
It's a really amazing place. There's this little town about 3 hours outside of Beijing where you walk in and you see people on the streets holding saxophones. You see farmers in the cornfields playing saxophones. You go to the local schools and there are elementary school bands, all saxophone. This little town called Sidankou has really embraced the saxophone culture and has made it their identity.
And the saxophone, from what I've read, was disapproved in China, especially after the Communist Revolution of 1949. And it was considered, capitalist music. But now, would you say it's making a comeback?
Yeah, it's been remarkable. In the 1960s and 70s, as you said, during the Cultural Revolution, there was a sense that saxophone music was the decadent music of capitalists, as they called it. It was associated with jazz and the ideas of individuality and free expression. So for a while there, it was really out of favor. And it's only in the past decade or so that it's really made a comeback in China. And you've seen that in little towns and in big cities as well. You see more and more students of saxophone, families who are encouraging their kids to play it, and competitions and bands and that kind of thing. But it's still a relatively new phenomenon.
A lot of the instruments, the Western instruments that are now being manufactured in Sidankou, are they making their way to the international market or are they mostly for Chinese consumption?
They're mostly for the international market. About 90% of the saxophones in Sidankou go abroad, most of it in the US, most of it also in the UK. But increasingly there's a domestic market, and that's something that they're trying to focus on as they think about the future of musical instrument production in this little town. They think that there is a big domestic market that just hasn't been reached its full potential yet, and they're focused on inspiring a new generation of players so that it becomes popular in China.
Javier Hernandez of the New York Times. Thought we'd treat you to just a little more Kenny G. That is all from us for now, though, on the Global News Podcast. There'll be an updated version of it later to download. If you want to comment on the podcast or any of the topics that we cover, you can send us an email. The address is globalpodcast@bbc.co.uk. I'm Jonathan Blake. Until next time, goodbye.